Hi, I'm Lou Eisen, boxing writer and historian, and today we have a special treat. We have Hall of Fame, International Boxing Hall of Fame promoter. Actually, he's a member of eight Hall of Fames, and he is, if there's a Mount Rushmore of boxing promotion, of sports promotion, Russell Peltz is on it. He's not only one of the greatest boxing promoters ever to have lived, going back 300 years, but he's one of the greatest promoters, sports promoters of all time in any sport, and extremely prolific, and described by my surrogate father, Angelo Dundee, as the only honest man in professional boxing. And that's saying something. As I said, he's a member of the International Boxing Hall of Fame. He's also a winner of the prestigious James J. Walker Boxing Writers Association of America Award for long meritorious service to boxing. The list of fighters, world champions that he's promoted is like looking at Jack Nicklaus's victory page on the PGA website. It's endless. So this is just a few. Mike Rossman, light heavyweight champions, Marvin Johnson, Matthew Saad Muhammad, Michael Spinks, Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, Prince Charles Williams. He also promoted Marvelous Marvin Hagler, world heavyweight champion Ernie Terrell, the incredible former world bantamweight champion Joltin Jeff Chandler, who not enough people know about, Robert Bam Bam Hines, former junior middleweight champion who beat my hero Matthew Hilton, and he publishes books every years ago, which just won the West Coast Boxing Writers Association Book of the Year. And this book is called $30 and a Cut Eye. And you can't say you have a boxing library if you don't have this book. This book is very evocative and it's absolutely magnificent. And we are pleased as punch to welcome Hall of Fame promoter Russell Peltz to our show today.
Glad to be here, Louis. Looking forward to this.
Thank you. Me too. You know, there's parts of your book where you laugh out loud, and then there's parts where you're just terrified. And the laugh out loud, Roger, is it Mtagawa?
Mtagwa.
Mtagawa, who you said about in the eye exam, he didn't fail it because he couldn't see, he failed it because he couldn't read.
Well, that's what his manager told everybody. It was probably a combination of he couldn't read and he couldn't see.
You know the story of Frank the Animal Fletcher, who you knew, obviously, and was fighting Juan Roldan, and after he got knocked down, he did a backwards somersault, and in between rounds, the referee said, "Do you know where you are?" And there at Caesar's Palace. He said, "I'm in New York." And so Padilla wanted to stop the fight, and his manager said, No. He didn't know where he was before the fight. You know, geography is not his strong point. But
Frankie was a trip.
Yeah, I was speaking about him with Tim Witherspoon a couple nights ago, and I have a question to ask you about Philadelphia. Angelo Dundee, who was from Philadelphia, as you well know, said that there's tough, there's super tough, and then there's Philadelphia tough. Guys that you could hit with your best shot and they just laugh at you. Where does this come from? Why have Philadelphia fighters traditionally not only been great world champions, but so incredibly tough?
Well, I think the city was fortunate to have the man, in my opinion, who was the greatest promoter who ever lived that nobody knows about, and that was Herman Taylor. Herman Taylor did the legwork. He was the real promoter of the first Dempsey Tunney fight that drew 120,000 people
right
in the rain. And 26 years later, in the same stadium, Marciano Walcott, he did Joe Louis. So, you know, he kept boxing going here from, I think he started in 1914 and his last card was in 1976.
Wow.
So there was a lot of opportunities here. And with the migration of the good black fighters from the South to Philadelphia, they got here before they got to New York.
Right.
See, it was a tough, hard scrabble city, Philly. Known more probably for its top contenders than world champions. But of course, you're talking about a time when it was tougher to become a real world champion.
Right. Well, Lou Tendler was one of the all-time greats. He's from Philadelphia and gave Benny Leonard the fight of his life.
Twice.
Yeah. And I was just looking at a very old book I have from the 1800s. Owen Ziegler was a fighter in the 1880s. Was another great fighter. So the history of Philadelphia. But I mean, you could say, is it fair to say that Philadelphia has produced as many great quality fighters as any other place in the world, if not more, along with New York?
Yeah, but yes, but New York, I don't know how many, well, they could say the same about Philly. How many were born and bred in New York? Um, you could say that about Philly, Frazier coming from North Carolina, Briscoe from Georgia, Boogaloo Watts from South Carolina. Um, but I think they established themselves in Philly a lot earlier than they established themselves in New York. New York was like the Las Vegas of its day, where all the top fighters would go to because Madison Square Garden was the venue. But I don't know, I'm prejudiced toward Philly.
Well, you made me smile in the book when you mentioned briefly Al Bummy Davis, who was my father's favorite fighter, along with Joe Louis, the great lightweight from.
There's a great story. Joe Granby, who was, I hate to call him the greatest black manager of all time, but he managed Bob Montgomery, and he was very close with
Lightweight.
Herman Taylor.
Right.
And they wanted to put Montgomery in with Bummy Davis in the Garden, and but he was already scheduled to fight Bo Jack for the title 2 weeks later. Now this was in the day before the 30-day suspension. If you got knocked out, you couldn't fight for 30 days. So Mike Jacobs, Granby didn't want the fight, but Mike Jacobs, the promoter at the Garden, guaranteed him that no matter what happened in the Bummy Davis fight, which was a 10-rounder, he would still fight Bo Jack 2 weeks later for the title. And of course, Montgomery got knocked out in the first round in front of 16 or 17,000 people. 2 weeks later, he beat Bo Jack for the world lightweight title in the same ring in front of 18,000 people.
Wow.
I mean, that's the kind of man Mike Jacobs was, and that's where boxing was back in those days.
And Bummy Davis had a tremendous left hook. My father was crushed because here in Toronto, where the anti-Semitism was high, all it said in the newspaper here was "Jew boxer dead," and that was it. He had to call his cousins in New York to get the newspaper sent up here, to find out about the history of him.
I hope we're not heading back to those days.
I hope not either. I mean, there was recently the Seaman Wiesenthal Museum opened up here, Toronto Holocaust Museum recently, and there was a survivor of Treblinka who said, I'm in my 90s, and I remember coming into the world in a concentration camp. It just seems now I'm going to be leaving the world and things aren't any better. So,
yeah.
But I agree with you. Did you encounter any of that racism in your career when you were starting out or during your career?
No, I really didn't. I never did. Not that I can think of, no.
Right. One of the things that terrified me reading in your book was, and it's like a punch in the stomach, when you had your office firebombed. And I mean, I don't know how do you you must have just gone numb. How do you take that in over time?
Well, we were at Foxwoods, my wife and I. We had just settled in to a beautiful suite that Jimmy Birchfield had given us. At that time, I was the guy in charge of making fights for ESPN. This was in June of '99, and we'd been out, having a good time with the crew, Teddy Atlas, Bob Papa, Robbie Biner, and we went back to our room. I guess I got the call about 1 a.m. from Maureen Sachs, my vice president, who lived in the building, and she was screaming into the phone that the office had been firebombed.
Wow.
So naturally, we left and drove back through the night, but we never found out who it was. A lot of people had theories. I lost one whole room was destroyed of boxing memorabilia, one of a kind stuff.
I read that.
Yeah. But you go on. You go on. It's we had windows installed, the kind that you can't throw a bomb through now.
Right.
But
well, the boxing memorabilia, I mean, that's more than boxing. It's American and world history, and irreplaceable.
I had a Kid Gavilan Gil Turner poster, which
Wow.
I'd never seen before. When they fought for the welterweight title in 1952, at the time, the crowd of over 39,000 was the largest crowd ever to watch a world welterweight title fight until Duran Leonard in Montreal in 1980.
Wow.
I've never seen one. And I've never seen one to this day. And that was just one of many things. Original covers of the Ring magazine, but what are you going to do? You move on.
One of the things that I don't know if it irritates you, but it irritates me when talking to people in the media that boxing's dead, UFC is where it's at. But when you look at the numbers, UFC does well the first time in, but then sort of trends down, where boxing always does well in similar or same locations. Why doesn't the media get that?
I don't. Boxing will always be around, but I see much more coverage of UFC, especially at ESPN, which is invested in boxing. They're invested in UFC too, but when I look on their website, when I look at the TV, I see that they give much more coverage to the UFC than they do to boxing. I'm not. Listen, there will always be big fights in boxing. What I'm worried about is the middle class. I couldn't, if I were getting into boxing today, I couldn't do it because an independent promoter cannot exist today in a major town, in a major sports town. There's too much competition for the entertainment dollar. And the biggest problem with boxing is that 95% of the income is generated by 5% of the people. You've got Top Rank, Eddie Hearn, Al Heyman, and Golden Boy controlling just about every inch of television. When you had USA Network and they gave shows to Art Palullo, Bill Kaczynski, Ron Weathers, Mike Akery, me, Murad Muhammad, they spread the wealth so you could develop fighters. The problem is, it might look good in the display window, but the cupboards are bare. I hate to be a downer, but
right.
I
understand.
Time when boxing was so wonderful, when it was so important. And one of the things that I think really hurts boxing that nobody really understands is the death of newspapers. Because, and I think I said this in the book, if you were a Philadelphia Eagles fan, and so you bought the newspaper and you went to read about the Eagles. But as you turn the pages, there would be a story on the fight coming up. So you'd have that crossover. Now, if you're a Philadelphia Eagles fan, you go to the Eagles website. There's no crossover. Right. The only people going to the boxing websites are the diehard fans. And that's a big problem.
Right. And it's caused by the internet in part. But I remember growing up, I was sort of an oddity in Canada because I didn't care for hockey. I liked boxing and baseball. And that's all that mattered to me. It's still the same thing. But there used to be writers, yourself, when you wrote for the Bulletin, that you wanted to be the boxing writer. And there were guys that specialized only in that.
Oh, and listen, we had a boxing writer, we had a golf writer, we had a track and field writer, we had a college basketball, pro basketball. We had a writer who covered horse racing, one who covered auto racing. I mean, come on. It was a different world. You'd go downtown on a Saturday night and the Sunday papers all week the papers would come out with 3 or 4 different editions, but on Saturday night there'd be like 6 or 7 editions. So you'd go downtown to a newsstand around 8 o'clock and you'd pick up the paper and it would say Phillies lead Milwaukee 5-3 after 6 innings.
Right.
That's how important newspapers were back then.
Well, I remember when Pacquiao fought Mayweather, and leading up to it for a couple months here in Toronto, in the Toronto Star, no coverage. Not of the fight and no coverage after the fight. And when I spoke to the editor there, their attitude was, who cares? And I look up the editor who I spoke to, and they're coming from the automotive section in the newspaper. And Angelo Dundee was saying, you should have asked, do you know who these guys are? I mean, it's sad because, as you know, in the 20s and 30s and 40s, it was boxing and baseball were the two top sports.
Professional, yes.
Yeah, and just incredible. Now, I have a quick. Angelo used to say, and you were brilliant at this. He used to say the art of building a prospect into a champion is a lost art, and no one did that better than you. Why is it a lost art? Is it because, as you said in your book, managers just want safe fights for their fighters?
Well, when he says building a champion, he means doing it the right way.
Right.
At a time when it meant something to be a world champion. Today,
There's so many.
it's um, everybody wants to be undefeated. I think Floyd Mayweather really cemented that in everybody's mind in the 21st century. So you have guys that are why isn't this guy in the Hall of Fame? He won 5 titles in 6 different divisions. I mean, it's let's say you have 4. Let's just say you have 4 lightweight champions: WBO, WBA, IBF, and WBC. In the 1950s, those guys, there would be one of them would be the world champ. The other 7 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So
Right.
you'd have in the 50s, the number 5 contender would be fighting the number 6 contender, even though today he's a world champion. So Conestoga's not inducting the number 5 lightweight contender from the 1950s, but today they'll induct a guy who's got 3 belts in 4 different divisions because it sounds better. It's just it's
It waters down the sport.
it's ludicrous. It really is, and I think the amount of world champions is probably, if not the biggest reason for boxing's loss of popularity, but it's in the top 1 or 2.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely, because I have friends of mine that have watched fights, and they just said, "There's one world. How can there be 4 or 5 champions? It's ridiculous."
It's like it's like if the NBA, if there were no playoffs, and I say this all the time, and each division winner walks around saying, "I'm the world champ." That's what boxing is.
Yeah, it's frustrating because, as you know, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, one undisputed champion, and there were 8 divisions. You knew who the names were, from flyweight up to heavyweight, and that was it. And sorry, go ahead.
I used to be when Carlos Ortiz was lightweight champ in the early 60s. I could name all the lightweight champs backwards from Carlos Ortiz back to Benny Leonard. I couldn't even tell you who the lightweight champs are today. It's the term world champion is so meaningless today. It's all about the money. And listen, I think it's great that these guys are being, I hate to use the word overpaid, but because boxing is such a dangerous sport, but the money they're getting paid is monopoly money. It doesn't equate to television ratings or paid crowds. It's
Right.
just ESPN and DAZN and Showtime hemorrhaging money. And I don't know why. Maybe they think one day it'll turn around and the ratings will change. But everybody the other day was going crazy because what fight was it a week or 2 ago that did 1.2 million? Oh, Teofimo Lopez. Did they
Right.
do 1 million? They did 1 million buys. Okay. So Ali Spinks from the Superdome in 1978 did 90 million homes.
Wow.
And we're doing cartwheels because Lopez and Taylor just did 1 million buys.
That's incredible. Do you think, I mean, that's one of the problems. I mean, PBC is also hemorrhaging money. And, I mean, growing up, I was privileged to grow up with Angelo as a mentor, but, one of the problems he said is, and I guess you'd agree, everyone wanted Floyd Mayweather money when Floyd Mayweather came, and everyone wanted Ali money, but not everyone gets that kind of money. That's extremely rare. But now you have all these fighters asking for money way out of proportion to what they've accomplished. Or does it really come down to asses in the seats? If you draw the fans, you get the money, and if you don't, that's just the way it goes.
If these fighters had to depend on ticket sales, they'd starve. They would starve.
Right.
And if Showtime and DAZN and ESPN were actually paying what fights are worth, they'd still starve. I mean, they'd make decent money, but hey, listen, that's great that they're making $4, $5, $6 million fighting what we used to see every Friday night on the Friday night fights. But don't turn around and tell me that they're all-time greats, because it's just how can you compare a world champion today? When Teofimo Lopez beat Lomachenko, I was reading where he could have beat Willie Pep. I was reading that on the internet.
Yeah.
And but there's a whole generation of boxing fans that think this is what boxing always was, like this.
That's because of the internet, because they make these top 10 lists. This brings me to another question I have for you. This is the top 10 list, and you look at a guy and who's making the list, he's 22. Well, how could you possibly know the top 10? You're eliminating everyone, before 1990. You're not including Jack Johnson or Jeffries or Benny Leonard, Lou Tendler, all these guys. Lou Tendler, there isn't a lightweight today in the world that would have gone more than 2 or 3 rounds with him. I mean, he would have wiped out that whole division if he were around today. So one of the things I noticed online with your comments, and it drives me nuts too, and you were there, so they can't. This is what kills me, that you were at these fights, you promoted them, and people still argue with you. It's insane. Like the first fight with Willie Monroe, and he convincingly really beats Hagler and beats him up. And then these idiots, these revisionists, come online and said Hagler was robbed. I mean, don't you think comments such as that hurt the sport?
That's why I wrote the book.
Right.
I know that book is 100% accurate. And one guy said, I saw a tape of the Hagler Monroe fight. Oh, you did? Really? Where did you get that? Because there was a snowstorm that night and our film crew couldn't get there. But all you have to do is read the newspaper stories the next day about what Hagler said and how he admitted that he wasn't there yet. People, that was one of the impetus for writing the book. You read things that people say, they act like they were there and they weren't.
Right.
I mean, I lived this. I mean, listen, when Boogaloo Watts got that decision over Hagler, the first one, which was a bad decision, and Boogaloo Watts was from Philly, and I was the promoter, and I was disgusted. I looked at one of the judges from Philly, and I said, "What are you doing?" And the president of the Spectrum said, "How can this happen?" So, and Boogaloo Watts to this day doesn't like to talk to me. Won't talk to me, but you don't have to win a fight 10-0. The Yankees don't have to win 20-0 to win a game. They can win a game 2-1. When the fight was over, you knew Hagler won.
Right.
It wasn't the worst to see. It wasn't like Everett Escalera, but there was no question who won the fight. It was Hagler. But the Willie Monroe fight was a completely different story. I hate to use this slogan, every dog has his day, because Willie Monroe was no dog, but that was his greatest night.
I love that line about the Boogaloo Watts fight, but it wasn't the worst decision I've seen, but it wasn't a good one either. That was a great line. And
I was embarrassed. I remember going to Sam Silverman after the fight, the promoter from Boston, who was sitting outside the dressing room. I said, "Sam, I'm sorry." And he looked at me. Now, Boston was also known for bad decisions.
Right.
He said, "Russell, don't worry about it. I've seen it before."
Yeah, I remember at the Hall of Fame when Pacquiao fought Bradley the first time, and Michael Buffer the next day said, "Well, this is part of boxing, and it'll happen again." And someone yelled out, "But it shouldn't." And people have to bear in mind, I guess, that after the fight, Pacquiao said, "I'm not angry at Tim Bradley. He's not the judge." And he faced such abuse. And the same thing with Boogaloo Watts. It's not his fault that the judges did that. But why? Is it just incompetent judging? People tend to read into it that, the mob was involved or they were paid off. But is it just the judges just got it wrong?
The fight wasn't big enough to involve the mob.
Right.
I think I think the judges were just homers.
Hmm.
Figured that the promoter, me, would want it that way, would want the Philly guy, insulting the fans.
Right.
Um, the only, listen, as I said in the book, the only fight that I promoted that I knew was crooked was the Everett Escalera title fight, in which the Philly judge took money to vote against Everett.
Right.
That's the only one I know was, 100% crooked. I don't care what anybody says. I was there. I know what happened. Did
Right.
I see the money change hands? No, you never see the money
You don't
change.
have to, from your
You look
experience.
at that fight and you see that Everett won between 10 and 12 out of 15 rounds. And you look at the history of the Philly judge and you see that the people that were in the building that night, and remembering how naive I wasn't even 30 years old yet, and how we just got taken for a ride.
Wow. It was Tyrone Everett the biggest, I don't want to say disappointment because he was a magnificent fighter, but the biggest upset, you would say, in the fact and how his life ended, that he had such a bright future in front of him?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I hate pound for pound lists. I hate, comparing fighters from different eras. You don't know. Like Jeff Chandler was 28 when when they took his license away. So who knows? And he was still learning on the job.
Right.
He lost his title because he had one arm that day. But you could go back through the history of boxing. Percy Bassett, the great featherweight from the early 50s, was 25 when he suffered a detached retina back in the days before you had those operations. So, Philly is strewn with those kind of stories. And that's why Philly, Rocky, it's a blue collar town. It's like Henry Cooper. He never won the heavyweight title. He was probably one of the most popular fighters in England.
Right.
Like Benny Briscoe, never won the title, or Gil Turner, but they were two of the most. Gypsy Joe Harris.
Right.
There's a guy who could have been great. Who knows? Their careers were cut short, but that's what made Philly.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Gypsy Joe. I'm glad you brought him up. Fantastic fighter, fascinating person, and he was blind in one eye, fought most of his career like that. And then this commissioner, is it McCall, who just comes in and says, okay, you can't fight anymore.
Well, what really, it was, he lost his license before. He tried to get his license back when McCall was in. Well, here's what happened. They knew Gypsy Joe was blind.
Mm-hmm.
You got doctors examining. One of the chief doctors at the athletic commission was an eye doctor. But Gypsy Joe was a loose cannon, and he was always late. They used to bring the fighters in a week ahead of time before the big fights. They called it for a pre-fight physical, the stethoscope and all that BS. But it was really to have a press conference with the press. And Gypsy was always late. And Herman Taylor, who was promoting some of his, after he lost to Griffith, his first fight in the summer of '68, he was coming back that November to fight Manny Gonzalez from Texas in his next fight. And Herman Taylor was promoting the fight. Now, Herman Taylor was connected. I mean, you almost had to be in those days.
Right.
You couldn't get, back in the day, you couldn't get a job as a dealer in Atlantic City at any of the underground blackjack tables without going through Herman Taylor. That's how strong he was. Anyway, so Gypsy comes late to the press conference, the pre-fight physical, and Herman Taylor's throwing a fit. So he goes up to Gypsy, says, son, you can't do this. You got to get your act together. I'm paraphrasing. And Gypsy Joe says, go F yourself. Get out of my face. Well, all of a sudden, they discovered that Gypsy Joe was blind. So draw your own conclusions.
Right. Well, people, I don't think fans generally realize that people that were mob fighters didn't really have a choice because the mob chose them. And you look at a guy like Johnny Saxton, who, had the stuffing beat out of him and then was just discarded, by the mob after his usefulness. And the same as when people would say Frank Sinatra played mob-owned clubs. Well, all clubs during his time were mob-owned, right? They were the only ones of the disposable income, enough of it to keep him open. Now, Larry Merchant, another great Philadelphian, great writer, said that the mob left boxing and then they were replaced by the sanctioning bodies. Would you agree with that?
What was that question?
He said,
Do I agree?
Yes, Larry Merchant said the mafia exited boxing and then they were replaced by the sanctioning bodies, this multitude of sanctioning bodies. As you mentioned earlier, IBF, WBC, WBA, WBO. And he said all these sanctioning bodies are just criminals gouging money from fighters and managers and promoters.
They're killing it. But you know what? It's never going to get to. Why can't they get together? They're never going to get together. None of the heads of the bodies are going to want to take a second seat to ever become. They say the WBC is the strongest. I mean, come on. I don't know any other business that could be run like this. It's the Wild West, and for years, hey, that was one of the intriguing things about boxing. It was the Wild West. But even though you can show examples of fighters who had to wait, like Archie Moore, 99% of the fights that had to be made were made. And they didn't, we didn't marinate them for 2 or 3 years. We marinated them for 2 or 3 weeks. People are going gaga about Crawford and Spence. And it's a big fight in today's world. But is it any bigger than Emil Griffith and Louis Rodriguez, who fought 4 times within 3 years?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's listen. Dick Tiger would win a fight. He'd beat Ace Armstrong. He'd beat Florentino Fernandez. He'd beat Henry Hank, and then he got a shot at Gene Fulmer.
Right.
That's the way it was.
Yeah.
You earned your shot and you got it. There wasn't all this ducking and years going by. Yeah, you could show me examples. The baloney they talk about, Ray Robinson ducking Charlie Burley and these other ridiculous stories that pop up from people who are like 40 years old.
Right.
What do they know about what went on? What do any of us know?
Right. You mentioned 2 great fighters from Angelo's stable, Florentino Fernandez, and his favorite fighter, which a lot of people don't know, was Louis Rodriguez. But
just one of the most underrated fighters in boxing history. I saw 3 of the 4 fights. The first one with 10-rounder with Griffith, I thought Rodriguez won. Okay. The second one in LA for the title, Rodriguez did win. I saw the third one live. It was June 8th of 1963. My dad took me to Madison Square Garden. It was a split decision. One judge had it 10-5 Rodriguez, which is what I had it as a kid. But they gave it to Griffith. The only one that I know that Griffith really won was the 4th one in Las Vegas. I saw that on TV. But given those decisions, the legacy of Rodriguez and Griffith could be completely reversed.
Right.
I mean, one of the ways that I like to judge a fighter, and it's in a book called The Sweet and Sour Science, something like that, is what the champion did in his post-championship days. Okay, so if you look at the post-championship days of both Griffith and Rodriguez, who were not big punchers, which meant they had to win decisions, and they won them on the road in hostile territories. I mean, come on. First of all, guys don't even do that today. I mean, Why do I have to fight him in his backyard? Before casinos, everybody fought somebody in somebody's backyard. But Rodriguez, what was his record? Like 105 wins and 7 losses, something like that?
Yeah, Angelo's favorite fighter. He was a fighter that influenced Muhammad Ali tremendously. And Angelo told me when he was fighting Monzon, he said after the 10th round, he said, "Your head, just run, stick and move."
You mean Benvenuti?
Benvenuti, you're right. I'm sorry, Nino. Thank you, Nino Benvenuti. And Louis said, "I'm going to knock him out." And Angelo grabbed him by his face. "You're not knocking Benvenuti out. He's 5 times your size. Just run, jab, run." And he goes out the next round, and he he gets caught, tries to slug, gets knocked out, comes back to the corner and says, I guess I should have just followed your advice and run. And Angelo just, slaps himself in the head. And Angelo, he says, I want to get him again. What do you mean you want to get him again? You just had him in front of you. You didn't listen the first time. So it would drive him nuts. You have a wonderful a photo in your book of Harold Johnson, the great light heavyweight champ, and he fought Willie Pastrano, who I think was fifth choice to fight him.
Third choice.
The other two guys. Now, what happened there? The other two guys fell out, or were injured?
Moro Mina from Peru, the greatest Peruvian fighter ever. He suffered a detached retina, so he was out. He was replaced by Henry Hank, and I don't remember why Hank was out. And then they put in Pastrano, and I watched the fight as a kid, and to me, okay, I was a Harold Johnson fan. I loved him. He was my boyhood idol, but he didn't lose that fight. I mean, it was just an outrageous decision. But Angelo, listen, I loved Angelo. He was one of the great ambassadors for boxing ever. But just him being in the corner, as nobody knew Skinny Davidson in Harold's corner. Nobody knew Pat Oliveri, the manager. So they gave it to Pastrano. I mean, and they weren't even smart enough to have a return clause in the contract. That's how, unsophisticated. And Harold could never get a shot. Meanwhile, he goes to Finland and beats a guy named Pekka Kokkonen. He goes to Germany and beats an undefeated guy named Luther Stengel. I mean, he was still beating world-class fighters in their backyards, but he got old.
The consensus was that Johnson won that fight, as you said, convincingly, and they just took it away from him for whatever reason. And I guess, having Angelo in your corner certainly helps, and having Chris as your brother, doesn't hurt either.
No, they were two great guys, but Chris more so than Angelo. Chris, wonderful guy, but Chris knew everybody in boxing. He dealt with Carbo and Palermo and all those guys. And listen, when Angelo came to Philly in '75 with Vinnie Curto to fight Benny Briscoe at the Spectrum, I remember going around at the end of the 9th round. I went around to all the boxing writers at ringside, said, Briscoe hasn't won a fight by decision, I don't know, in 4 or 5 years. All his wins have been by knockout. That's the kind of fight it was to me. It wasn't even close. And they scored it a draw, and Vinnie Curto could have won the standing high jump that night when they called that fight a draw. I've got the film of it, and You can see, because Angelo was in the corner. And I'm convinced that that's why they gave the fight a draw. Now, they fought again in Boston when Benny was completely gone and Vinny beat him. But, it just happened. Angelo was a great guy. And we didn't talk too much about that fight when I'd be with him, but he knew how I felt about Willie Pastrano. He would kid me all the time.
George Chuvalo would talk to me when Angelo was in the corner of Pete Rademacher. Is that the correct pronunciation?
What's the pronunciation? I didn't know he was in the corner.
And when he fought Chuvalo. And George said to me, I know you love Angelo and he's like a dad to you, but he had a lot of tricks up his sleeve. And he knew how to influence people. So when I asked Angelo about this, he said, yeah, I learned a lot of tricks from Ray Arcel. For instance, he said, you couldn't do it today, but when your fighter knocks the other guy down, Arcel will get up on the ring apron with his fighter's rope, forcing the referee to speed up his count. And he said, Angelo said there are a lot of tricks like that in boxing where you can influence the ref and judges. And, I learned from Ray Arcel, who learned from Doc Bagley, and he said it goes on and on. There's a lot to do. So, which brings me to something else. I was watching the fights last night. the Tim Tszyu fight, which was on. It was on too late for me, to be honest. And then the fight before that, earlier in the evening with Regis Prograis. And in Prograis' corner, there were three guys talking to him. And Angelo's rule was one guy. He said the fighter can only take in so much during a corner.
Wait, what did you say? The fighter what?
Angelo said a fighter can only take in so much.
Oh, right.
He's focused on what he's doing. So to have three guys talking is just too much.
Because a real trainer would tell the other two guys to shut up.
Right.
I'm in charge.
As he did with Bandini, you know. So do you think the quality of the training, I know it has in Canada, it's gone downhill. I mean, for a long time, Canadian fighters, obviously, if you want to make it, you got to go to the United States for any fighter and to get good quality trainers. But
sure. So these guys were lifers.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's too many fathers involved. Look at the aggravation they're going through with Teofimo Lopez.
Right.
I mean, you know, those guys, Ray Arcel, Whitey Bimstein, Freddie Brown, Chicky Ferreira, these guys were Charlie Golden. They were lifers. They weren't like electricians who came to the gym and trained guys at night. You know, this was their livelihood. They knew what they were doing. They knew all the tricks. Joe Polino in Philly, really reddish. I mean, I grew up, Yank Durham, Gwenzel McCall, Jimmy Arthur, Sam Saad, these guys knew what they were. I remember Quenzel trained Benny Briscoe for a while, and he had a young kid named Youngblood Williams who was in his second or third fight at the Spectrum. So this is like 74. So what am I? I'm 27, and the first round starts, and I'm yelling instructions to Youngblood Williams, you know, from my press seat. And Quenzel turns to me and says, "Son, sit in your seat, will you? Be quiet. I'll take care of this." You know, but today, you got every Tom, Dick, and Harry telling the guys what to do. And you know what? Some of them need to be told today. Some of these trainers today. Now you're watching. Okay, so you're talking about the TV fights last night. You know where I was last night? I was at Bally's Casino in Atlantic City. Sal Musamichi was running an off-TV show. The fights were good. There couldn't have been 250 people in the 1,500-seat ballroom. I had two kids on the show because I'm just trying to help out kids to help them out. Joey DeWaco, a heavyweight who's fought everybody, scored a one-round knockout. And this kid that wants me to help him, a junior welterweight from New York, from Ireland, Larry Friars, scored the biggest win of his career. He beat a 14-1 kid named Dimash Niyazov. I mean, to see the joy on Larry Friars' face for winning that BS title they gave him. Forget the title. It was a big win. Here's a kid that the New York Commission didn't want to even license 2 fights ago, and they finally did. He won a fight in Sony Hall, and then he gets this biggest fight of his career. I'm just interested in helping these kids. That's what boxing is about for me today. I got about a half a dozen kids who deserve to be matched according to their ability. Larry Friars is now 13-6, but he had a better resume than the guy he beat, who was 14-1, and we knew it, because he's fought Ohio State, UCLA, Southern Cal, Alabama. He didn't fight, the Little Sisters of the Poor or Centenary or Howard. Not knocking those colleges, but because too often these kids are sacrificed against Olympic gold medalists or undefeated prospects. And while they get paid better money, they get their heads handed to them. Right. They deserve to be able to fight on their own level without the manager buying the fight, which is something that I think should be outlawed, but can't be, where I could go to a promoter and say, listen, I'll pay Larry Friars, I'll pay his opponent, I'll pay the opponent's travel, hotel, meals, medicals, I'll pay Larry, and get him a win. That's what's going on. This used to be in Arkansas, used to be in Georgia, Used to be in South Carolina. Now it's all over. It's in Philly. How could this happen in Philly,
Yeah.
where these kind of fights are being promoted? This was like the bedrock of tough fights. Now even Philly managers are buying fights. So that's where my career is now. I haven't had a promoter's license since 2019. I'm just managing or advising some kids. And you know what? It's a lot of fun. And I told my wife the other day, I don't have contracts with any of these kids. There's about 6. And I found out that over the years, I had more trouble with fighters I had under contract than I had with fighters I had handshakes with. I never had a contract with Jeff Chandler. I never had a contract with Tony Thornton, the punching postman. They were, they were real people.
Well, your word was your bond. People could trust you.
And I trusted them, and that's the way it was. But it's just crazy today. It's crazy. I mean, look what's going on with Ryan Garcia and De La Hoya. I mean, come on. They can't get together. You're talking millions of dollars. You can't get that together. You can't sit down like gentlemen and work it out. You got lawyers. You know what? If Joey DeWaco decides to stiff me, which he won't, what am I going to do? Hire a lawyer and take him to court over $600 or $700? Forget it. The lawyers, they're going to get paid millions to settle that De La Hoya Garcia case. For what? For what?
Yeah, I know Angelo had a big problem with Mike Trainer with regards to Sugar Ray Leonard because, for a lot of reasons, I mean, he stiffed him on money, but...
Well, that's a big reason.
Yeah, and he also said, and he forced him under pressure to sign a contract in the dressing room, even though his son Jimmy, whom he called, said, don't sign it. And Angelo said, I have to run it by my lawyer. Mike Trainer said, I don't talk to lawyers.
So, a lawyer won't talk to other lawyers.
Right. And Angelo's son, Jimmy, said, actually, you're only supposed to talk to a lawyer. You're not supposed to talk to Angelo. But Mike Trainer wanted to match up Ray Leonard and Thomas Hearns after they only had 13 or 14 fights. And Angelo said, let them both win a title and then have them fight. And then make big money. Why wreck it now? And just all these, Angelo would tell me, like you're saying, all these peripheral people who know nothing about the sport, who come into the sport, and then, water it down.
I can't live with the fighters. I don't live with them.
Right.
I can't control who they talk to on the street. And, the promoter's always raping you. The manager's always stealing your money. They put it in their ear. It's like, I don't want to get into politics, but it's like Trump. It's like Trump.
Yeah.
I got screwed. They fake, and you hear it enough. They pound it into you.
Right.
It becomes the truth. The promoter is always the bad guy. I wrote in my book, we did 26 consecutive shows at the Blue Horizon over a 3 or 4 year period, and we lost money on every single show. Now, who's going to believe that? Who's going to believe that?
Right.
Oh, come on, Russell, you're laundering money. It's not true. I was there. I know what happened. I saved everything. I have every profit and loss statement. I have every bill. I have every program, including all the Flash Gordon programs from all my shows.
Those were wonderful programs.
Oh, my God. We talk all day.
What was the fight you saw when you were 12 or 13 that made you fall in love with boxing? You watched it with
It wasn't you mean on the first fight I saw on television when I was 12 was Gene Fulmer and Carmen Basilio, their first fight from the Cow Palace in 1959. And,
wow.
I think, it was a vicarious thrill before I even knew the meaning of the word vicarious. You picture yourself up there and and I was certainly far from being a tough kid. And I lived in an untough neighborhood, but as a present for my 14th birthday, my father took me to my first live fight against my mother's protest. And when I walked into conventional, Angelo was there with a fighter named Dun Vaillant, who beat Len Matthews, who was the number one contender at lightweight at the time. But December 6, 1960, and I walked in there, and the show hadn't started yet, and I saw that ring with all the cigar smoke. It was empty at the time. The first fight hadn't started, and it was It was so majestic. And I said, this is for, I had an epiphany before I even knew what that word meant. And I said to myself, this is going to be my life somehow. And I was raised I didn't go to school with any black kids till 10th grade. Okay. And the crowd there was 5,000 people. Maybe 40% were black, maybe 20% Hispanic. And I said, this is so cool. I've never been in this atmosphere before. And I went up to a guy, I don't know, light-skinned guy, and I said something to him. I don't know what I said, like, who's going to, as I was about to say something to him, he turned to his buddy and started speaking to him in Spanish. I went, holy shit, look at this. It was a whole new world for me.
Wow.
So that was it. There was no stopping me. And it's funny, I don't know if you know who Chuck Hassan is.
Yes.
Okay. Chuck Hassan knows as much about boxing history, certainly in Philly, as anybody. Chuck Hassan and I were both born December 9th, 1946. Right. Okay. Our fathers took us to the same first fight, December 6th, 1960. Truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah, that's fate. Bashir. Yeah, absolutely. That was meant to be. We have a question for you from Britain. Carl W. says, Russell, great story. I am based in the UK and just wondered if you ever worked with Frank Warren or Barry Hearn and what you think of Eddie Hearn as a promoter. I think you've answered that already, but
we'll save Eddie for last. I worked with Barry Hearn. Well, first, you know what Barry Hearn brought? What was the fight? Was it Nigel Benn and Michael Watson when Watson got messed up?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I had a kid on the show, undercard, named Joe Alexander. But Barry flew me over to London as a favor. I guess he was stuck. And Joe Alexander was turned down at the pre-fight physical at the weigh-in. I forget if it was the day of the fight or the day before. I can't remember. This was 1991. But Barry was nice enough not to kick us out. And we stayed for 2 or 3 days and went home. So the next year, he called for Tony Thornton to fight Chris Eubank in Glasgow, Scotland, which was a fight that more than a few people thought Thornton won. Anyway, when we got over there, part of the deal I made, Barry, we agreed on everything, but I want to tell you one thing, one stipulation. Do not deduct from the purse the money you spent on keeping me in England when Joe Alexander got turned down. I don't want you to be agreed. Barry was a gentleman. He was a great guy. And, everything was terrific. Frank Warren, I did business when Charles Brewer fought Joe Calzaghe in Cardiff, Wales in 2002, I think. And it was a great fight. Everybody was shocked because Brewer was an exciting fighter with a weak chin, but he stood up that night. He stood up, and I thought the fight was a little bit closer. He certainly didn't win it, but it was a terrific experience. I never had a problem with either guy. No problem. Of course, Mickey Duff and I were close. We had done a lot of business, but those guys over there got into it with each other. As far as Eddie Hearn, I don't have anything to say.
Okay. That's fair enough.
It's the old line: if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it.
Right.
So, I don't like. I'll just say this: he cost me Gabe Rosado. Gabe Rosado was my fighter, and I lost him because of Eddie Hearn. And I would never talk. I remember going into the dressing room one night at the arena in Philly, or the Spectrum, at a Herman Taylor show, trying to make a fight in the dressing room with guys that were fighting that night for Herman Taylor. And Joe Granby, the old manager of Tex Cobb and Thornton and Bob Montgomery, said, you don't ever do that. You don't ever go into another promoter's dressing room and try and make a fight. Okay? So if you're not doing that, you certainly don't go to another guy's fighter and talk to him. You just don't do it. But like I say, you can't steal a fighter who doesn't want to be stolen.
Right. Angelo never forgave Sylvester Stallone. He had a football player he was developing into a boxer, and Stallone said, "I'll take him for a couple months just to use for Rocky," and never paid Angelo for him. He said he would never return the fighter, and kept saying to the guy, "You're going to be an actor," and then just let him go. And by the time he got back to Angelo wasn't interested. But at the Hall of Fame, when they inducted Sylvester Stallone, Angelo wouldn't shake his hand.
Was that Lee Canalito?
I think it was, yeah. Yeah,
Lee Canalito fought for us one night at the Sands in Atlantic City in the 80s. Big guy. And Rich Giacchetti was in his corner. And when they walked out to the introductions, Canalito turned to Richie, told me the story. Canalito turned to Richie and said, "Am I in tough tonight?"
That's not really the right time to be asking. Now, Carl has another question. I don't want to make this British-centric, but best British fighter ever. I have to go with Lennox Lewis. Would you agree? Hard to say.
You know what? In 20 years, Lou, there's going to be guys in the NBA who are 9 feet tall, and they're going to say the guys today couldn't compete with them. In other words, was Lennox Lewis greater in his time than Randy Turpin was in his? Was he a bigger deal to British boxing than Freddie Mills was? Henry Cooper was?
Jimmy
Sure,
Ward.
if Lennox Lewis is fighting Henry Cooper in 2010, yeah, he's going to kick his ass.
Yeah.
If he's fighting him in 1964, where training was different, traveling was different, eating was different, and he probably wouldn't be 6'6" in 1964. So,
right.
No, I'm not. Listen, there are some terrific fighters in recent. Pernell Whitaker, to me, could have been a force in any era. Right. Duran could have been could Duran beat Ike Williams? I don't know, but he would have been. Ike Williams wouldn't walk over him any more than Duran would. You know, you can't compare eras. You can't say Lennox. You know, suppose John L. Sullivan. Could Lennox Lewis beat John L. Sullivan? Okay. When are they fighting in 1890 in some cornfield where you had to take a train and you're fighting like this, you know?
With the on a floating barge,
right? And you're not, and again, you're not 6. So these are joke comparisons. Right. I used to get involved in them. I mean, nobody even talks about. Do you know that Kid Gavilan had about 125 fights against the biggest monsters of all time? Okay, he was never stopped. He was on the deck 3 times. 3 times. He got up to win 2 of them. And the third one against Ike Williams, he won in rematches. I mean, imagine that. You know, and these guys who won't fight overseas, who won't fight in somebody's backyard. I don't want to get into it. I'm starting to babble. So you can't compare. He was not, in my opinion, the greatest British fighter of all time.
Well, I worked for Lennox. I don't think Lennox would himself declare himself to be the greatest British fighter.
No, I don't think he was that kind of guy.
And I think if I had to make a choice, I'd say Jimmy Wilde, the
Mighty Atom.
Yeah, the Mighty Atom, who, you know, except in his last fight when he got knocked out by Pancho Villa, he was unbeatable. And in the 60s, when they asked him about the flyweights today, he went, "They're bums. They don't go 5 rounds with me. They go 5 rounds if I'm drinking tea in between each round." But he said, "There's no way these guys beat me." And Benny Lynch, a Scottish flyweight champ. So yeah, I mean, especially in British boxing, it goes back 300 years. So it's hard to say categorically who was the best. Carl said it's about opinions, and that no matter the era you fight in, you have 2 arms and 2 fists. But the thing is, the styles change. And like you're saying with John L. Sullivan, like this, and the size and the height.
And the training and the travel and the eating and, you know.
I mean, you look at Marciano, he trained in water up to his chin to throw punches so he could throw them as quickly when he was out of water. And Angelo said he was there the first day he walked into the gym to see Charlie Goldman. And Goldman brought in a seasoned heavyweight who was a mover. And he said Marciano was falling down every time he threw a punch. He almost fell out of the ring. And Angelo kept saying to Charlie, I want to go to lunch. I'm hungry. It's almost 1:30. And Charlie says, I got a minute left on the watch. 60 seconds, I'll treat you to a steak. Just let him do it. I got to watch. I got to give him the whole minute. And as they look, Marciano is so off balance. He keeps falling. He lands one right hook on this guy, drops him, fractures his jaw. The guy doesn't fight again. And Angelo said, what do you think? And Charlie said, I'll take him because you can't teach that. Everything else can be taught. But power like that, you just can't teach.
No, Marciano takes a lot of gruff, gruff from modern day. Oh, he was a cruiserweight. Stop it. He didn't fight Nino Valdez. Well, Archie Moore beat Nino Valdez, and Marciano beat Archie Moore. I mean, the fight.
Valdez cried after the fight.
Right. Walcott was old. Walcott, that was the best Walcott there ever was. The one that fought Marciano that night.
Yeah, and people as Angelo would say, you can only fight who's around in your era at the time they're willing to fight you. And you can't put down Walcott because he was the undisputed world heavyweight champion. So, I mean, that fight in Philadelphia, Walcott's probably still on the mat after that. Is that the best right hand you've ever seen?
Yes, the best one-punch right hand, followed by Robinson's left hook on Gene Fulmer.
I was just about to say the perfect punch.
Better than, and because I can't compare Foster and Mike Quarry because you can't compare Mike Quarry to Gene Fulmer.
Right.
So Robinson's left hook on Fulmer and Marciano's right hand on Walcott. And by the way, when we were talking about Lennox Lewis, my favorite Lennox Lewis fight, Ray Mercer, when he stood and fired. Great fight, close fight. But that to me was that was one of the few times I enjoyed watching Lennox. That was the most enjoyment I ever got out of a Lennox Lewis fight, was watching that particular fight that nobody talks about. It's like nobody talks about Holyfield and Dokes, one of the most underrated heavyweight fights you could ever see.
That was a war. Holyfield had to bring it up from down home to beat him to get past Dokes. That was an incredible fight. When Lennox was promoting fights here, when I was working for him for a short time, and we touched on this earlier, he would shake his head, or fighters would come to him and say, well, I should get this kind of money, and I should get that kind of money. And he would say, you're a local Canadian fighter with an 8-3 record. Why do you think you should be making a couple $100,000 a fight? I don't understand. You have very little amateur experience. And, well, this guy, fighting in New York, he's getting this much. Right. He was an Olympic gold medalist. So that's why he gets a signing bonus. That's why he gets big money. You're just a local fighter. And I find that, do you find that happens a lot today? Fighters are just pricing themselves out of the market?
Listen, look how long it took to make Crawford and Spence.
Right.
I would walk into the gym in the 70s and guys would attack me. Get me a fight. Okay, I'll put you in the 6th round of your fight. And Joe Blow from Brooklyn. Fine. Didn't ask me how tall he was, whether he was righty or lefty, what his record was. Because you access to records back in those days, there was no box rec. There, and the Ring record book came out once a year. And you'd have to buy a Ring magazine and go through the agate type in the back, that 6-point type, if you were bringing in a kid from Mexico, and find out, who guys just wanted to fight. That's all they wanted to do. And, we were paying 4-round fighters $50 when I started at the Blue Horizon. 6-round kids were making $75. And if you were fighting the semifinal, you got $90. And we were charging $5 and $3 to get in. And they just wanted to fight. It's so, they all wound up punchy. Listen, they're all going to wind up, a lot of them are going to wind up in bad shape regardless, because, listen, we're just starting to learn about football.
Right.
We're just starting to learn that. And I tell these guys, it's not the fights. It's all that sparring you do every day in that gym, getting hit every day. Stop it already. You know how to fight. You don't need 100 rounds of sparring for a 4-round fight.
Right.
Imagine if you're boxing 3 days in the gym, 4 rounds a day. That's 12 rounds a week. That's 36 minutes a week. You're getting hit in the head. That can't be good for you.
No, I remember a good friend of mine is Art Hafey, the featherweight from
Right.
Nova Scotia who beat Oliveras, and he said, I just sparred too much. And back in the day, I had a guy I beat, but I had a big hematoma, and my manager just said, you're fighting in 2 weeks. And I have the next fight, and I go home to Halifax for Christmas, and I'm walking in the middle of the road, and a friend says, what are you doing? And he said, I'm walking. And he said, but you're in the road. He said, no, I'm not. And then, of course, they take him to the hospital, and he's got a severe blood on the brain, got a hematoma. But he said, I couldn't quit because I had my biggest fights coming up against Little Red Lopez and Arguello. And back in the 70s, they're for 25 grand a piece. I can't turn that down.
No, it's a lot of money back then.
And especially for feathers. There's a good point here Carl brings up. He said, from a promoter's perspective, you've seen what's going on in the Middle East with fighters getting paid, and same in golf, untold tens of millions. I mean, how does this, this, I guess, negatively changes the boxing landscape, but how do you feel that it affects the boxing?
Hey, it's good for the 1 to 2 to 5% of the fighters who can make that kind of money.
Right.
I can sit here and say that I'm not in favor of the way Saudi Arabia treats women.
I agree.
But which is what the PGA says to the LIV on the golf tour. But you're talking about unheard millions of dollars being paid to kids who came from abject poverty. So I don't like it. I don't think it bodes well for the future of the sport. I think it's just like I say, there's good fighters from Philly, but Philly boxing is dead. I mean, every now and then there's a good fight next week in Philly. Tevin Farmer's fighting Avery Sparrow, which I don't understand how they were able to make that fight in a 1,000 seat arena, other than Tevin Farmer bankrolling the fight. But on a consistent basis, you can't draw 1,000 people to a fight in Philly on a consistent basis. That's sad.
Well, that is sad, because Philly was one of the four corners, or two corners, I guess, with New York, of the boxing world for well over 100 years. I mean,
you had St. Louis, you had Detroit, you had Chicago, you had Dallas, Chris was in Miami Beach, you had the Olympic. Oh my God, I was fortunate enough to be at 2 fights at the Olympic in LA. One, Don Chargan put me on the front row. Lupe Pintor against Superfly Sandoval for the bantamweight title. People say, well, is your biggest regret not signing Marvin Hagler? My biggest regret is not working harder to make Jeff Chandler and Lupe Pintor. That's a regret I have. And you know what? The fight would have belonged at the Olympic, because it was a bigger fight out there than it would have been in Philly or Atlantic City. And Jeff wouldn't have cared, because he went to Tokyo twice and he won the title against a Puerto Rican in Miami. And that would have been, but there just wasn't, I just didn't work hard enough to do it. But, that's a big regret I have.
I wanted to ask you, when you're, you have a who's who of all-time great fighters. When your fighters that you promoted and nursed from the beginning to a world title, the night they won the world title, were you able to enjoy it that moment, or were you so engrossed in making sure the whole promotion is going smoothly that it took a while for it to sink in that this guy is now, Jeff Chandler, is now a world champion?
When Chandler won the world title in Miami, I remember running up. I've been in the ring 3 times in my life, inside the ropes, because I don't believe in it. I think it's a bunch of bullshit. The promoter, the agent, the manager, the lawyer. I mean, who cares? Get out of the ring. I was forced to go into the ring at the Everett Escalera fight because Butch Lewis wanted to take all the credit for it. He was working for Top Rank. So I had to go into the ring. I was in the ring when Marvin Johnson beat Leslie Stewart to win the title for the third time. Fred Burns made me get in the ring. And he made me get in the ring when Prince Charles Williams beat Bobby Ches. But, when I was writing the book, I said, you know what? Did I enjoy this? I mean, I have video. My number one moment in boxing will always be Benny Briscoe over Tony Mundine in Paris in '74. And I have video of the dressing room that my brother-in-law took. Video, not photos, video of me wearing a polyester three-piece suit with a big bow tie that a clown would squirt water out of. And I looked like Gene Shalit, the movie critic, with a big mustache.
Right.
And I'm hugging Benny and I'm kissing him, and I got this shit-eating grin. Sometimes you can smile and you can't get the smile off your face. I looked like the biggest nerd you ever saw. But when Jason Sosa in 2016, we went to Beijing and beat Javier Fortuna for the WBA junior lightweight title. Okay? Losing the whole fight. He got off the floor, stopped him in the 11th round. My wife, Linda, who doesn't get that crazy, got up and was screaming. And we went back to the hotel, which was literally across the street from the arena. And Linda went up to her room, and Sosa, they all went up to call the United States. There was a bar that was open in the hotel. Neon bar, really dark. The only lights were neon lights. I was the only guy at the bar, a square bar. There was one group of people at a booth. And I sat at that bar, so it was around 11 o'clock at night. And I knew that with the time change, people were soon going to be waking up to read that Sosa had scored this monstrous upset. So I said, listen, your whole life, you got to slow down, enjoy this.
Right.
Because before you know it, it's going to be morning. So I had two of the most delicious beers of my life. And I just tried to sit there and soak in the satisfaction, especially because it came so late in my career.
Right.
When you're wondering, do you still have it? Can you still do it? And Sosa was as blue collar a fighter as you could find. So, no, I think I tell people now, you're young, enjoy life. It goes so fast. You're so busy, wondering what, even if it's not your promotion, even when there's no bigger thrill than winning a big fight out of town. And Briscoe Mundine was number one. And actually, late in his career, Briscoe and Tony Schiavone in Kansas City in front of 10,000 racists was a big win at the end of his career. And Sosa and Fortuna, you got to enjoy it. You got to smell the roses, as they say.
You're upset me. Benny Briscoe should be in the Hall of Fame. Don't you agree?
I mean,
he competed at
there's guys in the Hall of Fame that don't have his resume.
Right.
So if you're going by that, and I'm not going to mention names because, I wouldn't do that. I'm at odds with the Hall of Fame. I don't like what's going on at the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like who's been getting in at the Hall of Fame. I don't like the process. I don't like to see monster ads in the program. And all of a sudden, people who work for the companies that take out those monster ads are getting inducted. And I'm probably going to get sued for slander now. But he's got a better resume than some guys that are in the. But he didn't win a world title. Joey Archer never won a world title, but he beat Dick Tiger. He beat Hurricane Carter. He lost 2 hairline decisions to Emil Griffith. Today, he'd have a title.
Right.
But back then, so George Benton's in the Hall of Fame as a trainer.
Right, great trainer.
Who did Bernard Hopkins beat that Benny Briscoe couldn't beat? Who did he beat? And I love Bernard Hopkins. I'm not taking anything away from him. But who did he beat that Benny Briscoe couldn't beat? A welterweight in Felix Trinidad?
Right.
Come on.
Right. That's a good. That Kelly Pavlik. I mean, these are all guys that would have been sparring partners for Benny Briscoe.
Yeah, but see, there I go again, comparing fighters from different eras, and I don't want to do it. But I mean,
that's
listen, my kids said to me when my kids were like teenagers, they said, "But well," they said, "What was Benny Briscoe's record?" I'd say 66, 24, and whoa, they started laughing. 24 losses. What's the big deal? You can't explain it. You just can't explain it.
No, it's one of my favorite fighters is this is going back well over 100 years. George Dixon from Nova Scotia was the first black man to ever win a world title.
Right.
And people will say, but he had 35, 40 losses. Right, out of 800 fights. So, you know, and same with Briscoe. If you look at who he fought and some of the decisions he got screwed on, I mean, definitely you have to look at how great he was and what he did in the ring, what he brought to the sport, his legacy, who he influenced, and the fact that today we're still talking about him and people all over the world are still talking about him.
Yeah, they have the Briscoe Awards in Philly that they give every year to. They don't. It's not the Frazier Awards. It's not the Hopkins Awards. It's the Briscoe Awards.
Right.
It's like Henry Cooper. In London. He's always gonna be revered, whether or not he belongs in the Hall of Fame.
Well, I mean, I'm on the old timers selection committee for the Hall of Fame, so I'm looking at guys from the 30s or 20s and before, which is one of my favorite eras. And I always get surprised when people talk about Tyson Fury. He's a fantastic boxer. And I think, are you kidding me? Ali was a fantastic technical boxer. You know, guys as big as Fury don't have good balance usually. Or, you know, Hasim Rahman would have beaten Joe Louis. And I always think when Angelo would say, no one beats Joe Louis. Greatest fighting machine ever assembled by God or man. He said, on his best night, the second Schmeling fight, Louis beats any man that ever lived. Hands down. Just absolutely perfect. Carl from Britain again wants to know, just before we let you go, your thoughts on Don King. But I would think everyone has thoughts. Don is, I guess, in his 90s now.
Yeah, I think he's 91.
Mm-hmm.
I did very little business with Don King. Probably the biggest fight I ever did with Don King was Jerry Martin when he went into Rahway Prison,
right,
and beat James Scott on NBC.
Mm-hmm.
And we made the deal. Nobody knew who Jerry Martin was, even though he was in the top 10. And we're sitting in a cell for the dressing room, getting ready to go out. And two of King's guys come in the dressing room with a contract calling for 3 options in the event Jerry won. This is the first time it's coming up. We got 20 minutes to go. And they're sticking there. I said, get out of here. Well, Don King threatened to cancel the telecast. And I said, he's not going to cancel the telecast. And Ferdy Pacheco comes in, who had bought the fight for NBC. And this was the same year, that 1980, that Ferdy had taken over and broken the monopoly that Arum and King had on network TV, which they had for years. And I had already had Curtis Parker on twice that year on NBC. And Ferdy came in and said, Russell, I got you on NBC twice. Do me a favor and sign the options. What could I say? So we signed the options, and Jerry went out and beat James Scott. And then Arum came along and wanted to put him in with Eddie Gregory for the title, Eddie Mustafa, and we couldn't do it. I said, we're obligated to King. Arum went ballistic. It eventually cost me my job with him at I was one of the original ESPN promoters, me, Mel Greb, Ernie Terrell, and Dan Duva. And I said, Bob, the only way I can do it is if you give me a hold harmless indemnity, meaning when King sues, you're responsible for paying for the lawsuit. I mean, Teddy Brenner, Arum was screaming. Teddy Brenner had to take me out of the office to walk around the block in New York and have lunch. And Arum eventually did. He gave me a hold harmless indemnity. And then the next year, he got rid of me as one of the original ESPN guys. And they eventually settled the lawsuit. They traded lawsuits. You don't sue me for Jerry Martin, I won't sue you for something else. But and listen, I've had a good relationship with Aram, but no marriage is perfect. You have your ups
Right.
and downs.
Right.
So I never trusted King, but he never screwed me. He never screwed me.
Tim Witherspoon, when I said I would be interviewing you, he said Russell, very tough but very fair. Honest
Tim
guy.
Witherspoon is a completely different person today from the one that Don King promoted. I said to him recently, I said, how come you weren't that nice back then? We couldn't talk to you. I said, what are you doing? Why are you accepting these things? He said, I was young and immature. I didn't know any better. And he's a great guy, Tim Witherspoon. He's a good ambassador for boxing these days. He had his pro debut for me. And though it's not in the official records, the largest crowd in the history of the Blue Horizon.
Wow.
Which sat 1,346 people. We had 2,100 people in there. And you say, well, you go to a place and it was so packed you couldn't move. You couldn't move. I went upstairs and I couldn't get to the ring. But we only reported 1,385 tickets.
Right. That may have been the best boxing venue ever. I mean, that space, that's the ideal space and the ideal way to watch boxing.
Well, the Olympic in LA was pretty good. And I think there's a place in England, I don't know if it's Royal Albert Hall or whatever it is, that they say is pretty good. But for its size, the Blue Horizon was, guys just wanted to fight at the Blue Horizon.
I have two questions to ask you, two more questions before I let you go. One, I loved, as a teenager, Mike Rossman. And William Detloff said you were the only one that was able to get him in the last 40 years to come out to a public event.
Function.
Yeah, why is he so reticent to come out? Like Nigel Collins said to me, doesn't like the media, doesn't trust the media, doesn't want to have anything to do with other people. But why? Is there a reason for that?
Mike Rossman lives in a rundown, abandoned motel on Pacific Avenue, a block right across the street from what used to be the Golden Nugget, where Jerry Martin fought Saad Muhammad in 1981, now shuttered. It's going to become a hotel. He has a problem with alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
He always had a problem with alcohol. Even the Galindez fight, the first Galindez fight, was the one where he was completely sober and went away to camp. And he likes me because he likes my wife. In fact, I said to Linda last night, we ought to take Mike out to dinner one night. She said, fine. He just, I don't know what it is. He has I got him to go to the Atlantic City Boxing Hall of Fame last year. Duran was there. A lot of guys were there getting paid $40, $50, $60 to sign their autographs. He didn't want to charge anybody. He said, how can I? It's a good thing about him. He said, how can I? I said, Michael, I finally got him to accept $10 for 3 pictures at the end and for $30. He said, how can I charge people to sign an autograph? But, he's got a decent pension from the Roofers Union, which keeps him solvent. But he's just listen, his father cheated him out of money, stole his money, double dipped him on your own father.
That's horrible.
There's 150 grand on the table, and you're putting 50 in your pocket and taking your cut out of the 100.
That's unforgivable.
Your own father.
Unconscionable.
So, but he, at his father's funeral, he cried. That's when he told me he was making one more comeback. I might be the only person in boxing he still talks to. So, but he came there and Randy Gordon was doing an interview with him, and 2 minutes into the interview, he turned and walked away. Just walked away.
Yeah.
So, I can't explain it.
What do you have planned for your Father's Day? Rest of your Father's Day?
We might go on the beach, or I might take a nap, or I don't know. I was up last night late at the fights,
Right.
so I'm basking in the satisfaction that two guys I like, Larry Fryers and Joey DeWaco, won last night.
Was it?
I get a lot of satisfaction out of helping these kids. I really do. It's it's put the fun back in boxing, which I didn't see Lopez. I didn't see the Haney Loman who fought Lomachenko.
Haney, Devin Haney.
Haney. I don't. I won't buy a pay-per-view. I
Right.
refuse. I don't pay for the NBA finals. I don't pay for the World Series. I'm not paying for. I'm not that interested. Will I watch Crawford and Spence? Yeah, I'll go to a bar where they'll
That's
let
what I
me in
do. Yeah.
and I'll watch it. I think it's outrageous. Um, so this is where I'm at. Chris Burgos, a junior welterweight, 4 wins, 6 losses, 3 draws, trying to help him out. D'Angelo Fuentes, 8-1 featherweight from Coconut Creek, Florida, trying to help him out. Bryce Mills, a nice prospect out of Liverpool, brings 300 people to Turning Stone when he fights. 12-1. I'm trying to help him out. Are any of these guys going to be world champs? I don't know, but I'm not going to sacrifice them and get them hurt for big money.
Right. And to have somebody like you on their side is an incredible boost with all that experience that you bring and all the world champions you've been with and great fighters.
I tell these managers who buy fights, what are you doing? You got to be the dumbest people on the face of the earth to buy a fight. You're going to be 5,000-6,000 in the hole. So you bought your kid a win. Now what are you going to do? You're going to spend another 5,000 or 6,000? Where are you going to make it back? Is your kid going to win the world title? You're going to have to win the world title and defend it a couple times just to break even. Wait the promoters out. They got to come to you. They're running out of opponents. The commissions are starting to turn down guys that have lost 5, 6 in a row by knockout. Wait your turn. I told Larry Fryers, I told Bryce Mills, we're not buying fights. We'll wait. We'll get the right fights. I told Joey DeWaco, I said, what your promoter did for you, putting you in those monster fights overseas for 6 figures, you could have done on your own. Anybody could do that. So now he's won 4 in a row. Okay. He's got a roofing company. He loves to fight. I said, we'll get a break. But when we get the break, it's not going to be just for the money. It's going to be for the money, but maybe in a fight that you can win.
Yes.
So, I like that. I like that. I'm not going to deal with the IBF or the WBC and their getting franchise belts and
Right.
their interim titles and recess. And it's just
They're beneath contempt. And someone who's as highly respected as you and has your experience and is in 8 different halls of fame and is a historical figure, I mean, that would be beneath you, So
you know what Marilyn Monroe said? It's one of the great quotes. She says, if you survive long enough, you're revered like an old building. It's a great line.
Angelo would deal with some of these people in boxing in the early 2000s, and he would come away and he'd look at me and say, dumb, 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 dumb mother, he just said, I can't, just get rid of him, please. I said, what do you mean get rid of him? Just say that I'm tired and I need to go. I just don't want to deal with it anymore.
What a wonderful, I treasure the dealings I had with Angelo, Chris, Gil Clancy. I mean, these were guys who gave me respect when I was in my 20s, my early 20s. And they were just Rip Valenti. Teddy Brenner was tough, but over the years, he wrote some very nice inscriptions in his book for me, Only the Ring Was Square. We had a mutual respect, but these guys today,
yeah, it's nothing like it. And one quick story before I let you go. I met Angelo when I was 13 when he brought Jose Napoles to Toronto to fight Clyde Gray. And I waited after the fight to meet Angelo, and I was talking to him, and I was boxing as an amateur. I wasn't very good. And he said, are you good? And I said, I'm pretty good. And he said, got to be special. You can't be in boxing unless you're special. And so I was crestfallen. And he said, but you said you like English and history, so you can write about boxing. But he said to me that your problem is your head is so big that the other fighter could hit you without leaving his corner. And so because of that, he's just going to stand there salivating. And it's not fun to get hit from 20 feet across the ring.
Really?
Yeah. So then he said, you want to meet the big guy? And then Muhammad came out, at which point I just stood there and cried because I couldn't believe I was meeting him. But
great story.
He always called him the big guy. I just want to say thank you so much for being on. It's been absolutely a privilege and a pleasure. This is the book, $30 and a cut eye. The book is available on Amazon. Where else is it available?
Just to go for Amazon.
Okay, go for Amazon. This is a wonderful book, and hopefully there'll be a second one coming.
Oh, geez, no.
No, okay.
One's enough.
This could be turned into a movie, as you know. And it's just a fantastic book. I suggest everyone, I urge everyone, this would be the greatest Father's Day and Grandfather's Day gift you're going to give to your father or grandfather or your son. And I want to thank Hall of Fame promoter Russell Peltz for taking time and allowing us to go over his fantastic, rich, evocative history in the sport, which, thank God for the sport, still continues to this very day. And if there's a Mount Rushmore of boxing promoters, he'll be up there with Mike Jacobs, and I guess Tex Rickard would be the other one, and Bob Arum. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your Father's Day, and Russell, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Whenever.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's been fun.
Oh, thank you. I've had a blast. It's been wonderful to talk with you. Thank you.